The biggest complaint I've seen people make about the finale is that there was just too much Jax. And that makes sense. He takes up the bulk of the episode, and while we get a deep insight into his story and mind, we never got the chance to explore the rest of the cast as deeply. And for what time there is left, most of it is used on Caine's redemption. So if you weren't already a fan of Jax or Caine, it makes complete sense if you feel the other characters got shafted. But that does raise a question. Why? In the show as tightly written and planned as this one, what could have been the reason for putting so much focus on these two characters? And to answer that, the first thing we need to look at is the show's themes. The best way to find the theme of a show is to compare how it begins and ends. And with this show, the answer to both is Pomni. The show starts with her teleporting into the circus. She's panicking and scared and doesn't know anybody there. She feels alone. And her mental state only gets worse as time goes on. She loses one of the first friends she makes in Gummy Goo, faces supernatural monsters, gets possessed, and more. And all of this wears her down, to the point where she starts to break down completely while she's trapped with Kinger in episode 3. Now, this is a completely normal reaction that anyone would have while in her shoes. But the important part is what happens after. Kinger sits down with her, opens up about his own story, and is able to calm her down to the point they're able to escape where they are and rejoin the group. And this isn't the only time this happens. Ragatha is always checking in on her and making sure she's alright, even inviting her to Kaufmo's funeral. Zubul and Gangle open up about themselves in the bar adventure, and they all work together to support each other when Caine loses control. And by the end of the show, Pomni is no longer afraid. She's calm, at peace with the circus, and surrounded by friends. And she isn't the only place we see this. When Ragatha was struggling, she leaned on Pomni and Kinger. When Gangle and Zubul were struggling, they leaned on each other, and Kinger was Kinger. And they all end up in the same place as Pomni, happy and content. Every character in the show finds peace by leaning on those around them. Every character except Jax, and up until the end, Caine. While the rest of the cast lean on each other when in pain, Jax and Caine did the opposite. Jax, due to having trauma from his past, cannot allow himself to be vulnerable. Even when people tries to comfort him, he attacks them and pushes them away because he'd rather be alone than put himself at risk of being hurt. And Caine does similarly. Even when the cast tries to communicate with him and explain the damage he's caused, he either disregards it or lashes out because, like Jax, he is afraid. Not of them using his vulnerabilities against them, but afraid of what it means about him if he acknowledges that what he was doing was wrong. After all, if your entire goal is to make your guests happy, but your actions make them miserable, that must mean that you're doing something wrong, that there's a part of you that needs to be fixed, right? So, while we see the rest of the cast able to talk through the issues and move forward, for Jax and Caine, it's easier to attack the ones pointing out the flaw than deal with the pain of acknowledging it. In this way, they act as a foil for the rest of the cast. One shows what happens when you lean on others, and one shows what happens when you don't. And for Caine and Jax, their inability to talk and open up leads to the same ending. They end up alone, and, in a way, dead. Now, with Jax, even in his dying moments, he never directly apologizes for what he's done. He hates himself for it. acknowledges that it's his own doing and does show some vulnerability, hugging Pomni and crying and saying he's afraid to die. However, he still tried pushing her away up until his very last few seconds, and his statements were still very centered on himself and still very defensive, such as, "I hate you. You complicated everything. I'm a terrible person. Is that what you want me to say?" So on and so forth. So while he does feel guilt for his actions, guilt does not equal atonement. Feeling bad for how you treated someone is not the same as apologizing for it and changing. He kept pushing people away and centering his emotions until the very end, and as a result, he lost his life. Now, let's compare that to Caine. Though it takes him a minute to come to terms with it, he does fully acknowledge that he was wrong. He feels guilt for what he's done, absolutely. But even when he's talking to himself, he doesn't make his guilt the focus. Rather, he focuses on the pain he's caused. He acknowledges that he's the one that pushed others away, that he caused pain, and that he needs to take action to fix it. And he does. He goes out of his way to learn more about the cast, makes them a gift, and even gives up much of his power over them. And when he goes to ask for forgiveness, he never makes his pain the focus. He shows the work that he's done to improve, acknowledges that he did awful things. He explains why he understands now, and gives them the option to accept him in their own time. And through patience and consistent effort, they all do. And Caine ends up happy and at peace for it. Just like the rest of the cast, he gets healed through community. So while Jax and Caine are a foil to the rest of the cast, they also act as a foil to each other. One showing what happens when you isolate yourself until the end, and one showing what happens when you isolate yourself, but then choose to be better, atone, and open up to those around you. Overall, the show asks the viewer one main question: what do you do when you deal with adversity? Do you lean on those around you, or try to carry the burden on your own? And while it never answers it directly, it does show you the two different outcomes. One leaves you alone and in pain, and the other lets you heal and move on. Now, by the end of the finale, we'd already seen the results of leaning on others. Gangle, Zubul, Ragatha, Pomni, and Kinger had already supported each other multiple times, and were all happier for it. Meanwhile, we hadn't fully seen the results of choosing to be alone, so it makes sense that for the final episode, it would focus primarily on the two characters that represent that, Caine and Jax. And while it does show the reality of taking on more than you can handle, using Caine, it also ends on a very hopeful note. That even if you've done wrong, it's still possible to repair the damage you've caused, heal, and be happy. So yes, while it would have been nice to get more lore or to have done more of a deep dive into the other characters, for a show that's all about community and the consequences of rejecting it, it makes the most sense for the finale to be about the characters that most embody that idea. Because at the end of the day, this show was never about deep lore or mystery, but about people and how they cope when faced with challenges. And when you keep that in mind, it becomes easier to see that, for the amount of time they had, this might have just been the perfect ending for this show.